Now, so Aristotle said, while the faculty of sensation is dependent upon the body, mind is separable from it. As Woodbury said, he had no word for spiritual. What he meant is it doesn't mix with matter, it doesn't mix with the body. So he had no word for that. So the Arabs seized on that, and they thought it was separated. They misunderstood the Greek, apparently, and they thought it meant separated. There's the references there. By the way, something's wrong here. Ibid. Gee, that needs a correction. The same, that means, but there's nothing before it. I changed the order of things, I know that, and that's a bit out of order. And this is what Aristotle said now. I've taken the liberty of taking out of his famous work on the soul. De anima, on the soul. You see, the people who tell us that soul is a religious term, boy, they've got a lot to learn. The ancients used the word anima in Latin for soul, but psyche, in other words, psyche, the Greeks used that. So as Dr. Russell said to a student on one occasion who said, I don't like that term, it's a religious term. He said, well, don't you ever use in this classroom the word psychology or the word animal? Animal means a soul-y thing. Psychology means knowledge about the soul. The student was taken aback, I believe. So this is what Aristotle said. Therefore, since everything is a possible object of thought, we can think about cows, we can think about milking, we can think about udders, like the twin calves that were born. One says, pass the udder to my little brother. Mother, will you? So, everything is possible object of thought, mind in order, as Anaxagoras says, to dominate, that is to know, must be pure from all admixture. Anaxagoras used the word dominate, and you know, this text I put in here, I thought that's not in there. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with all of this because, well, you know, every day, from the early hours of the morning, I'm rushed to Buffalo and then subjected to radiation. It's having quite an effect on me, but I'm trying to get this all in balance, and sometimes I overlook little things. Like the text I sent out first, in the last 48 hours I sent it out, it was had one same text twice, you might have noticed that, but I didn't notice it. So, he used the word, Anaxagoras used the word dominate in the Greek rather than know. They didn't have sufficient terms to be able to sort of explain themselves. That's where a man like Woodbury is utterly a genius. In the classroom, he could use terms like you've never heard them. You know, you talk about animals, all their sounds are passion sounds, and they're all about eaties and sexies. And I heard no other philosopher say that, but it's implicit in Aristotle. So, it must have no idea in its nature. In fact, it doesn't have a nature, properly speaking. It's a pure capacity of the soul. That's what the intellect is. If it had some nature in it, then everything it said would be in terms of that nature. But the intellect is a passivity for knowledge. All sorts of forms can come into that. So he says, for the co-presence, this is on page 63 of course, about a third of the way down the page, for the co-presence of what is alien to its nature is a hindrance and a block. Remember that principle, remember there, what's in there, principle prohibits the structure, prohibits good. It just completed his treatment on the senses. Can have no nature of its own, other than that of having a certain capacity. Just as the sight cannot have in its nature blue, So the intellect cannot have in its nature the nature of a tree, or something like that. Thus, that is soul which called mind. By mind I mean that whereby the soul thinks and judges, is, before it thinks, not actually any real thing. In other words, it's not a completed thing, it's a capacity for receiving all other things. If it were fixed to receive only one thing, then everything else it received, it would receive in terms of that one thing. For this reason, it cannot reasonably be regarded as blended with the body. If so, it would acquire some quality, such as warmth or cold, or even have an organ like the sensitive faculty. As it is, it has none. It was a good idea to call the soul the place of forms, though this description holds only of the intellective soul. One, it holds of that, and two, even this is the forms only potentially, not actually. My sister is fond of saying, you must think with your brain. No matter what I tell her, just ignores it. You think with your brain. Don't think with your brain, you think with your intellect. And then people tell me, when I was teaching in French, for instance, when I started, one lad came up to me during class, we had a break, an hour and a half class. He said, excuse me, monsieur, he said, we don't use that term intellect in French, we use intelligence, intelligence. And I said, have you read the book that you've got in front of you? What does he use? He uses intellect. Intelligence is a freely used word, and even Maritain uses it. Yes, he's right in that respect. It can be used. But strictly speaking, when you're teaching a science like this, intellect is the power, intelligence is a quality added to the power that perfects its thinking. It's one of the 6 intellectual virtues. In other words, it's the capacity, or it's the knowledge we have of the basic principles. So, it's the forms, all forms potentially, from tadpoles to God. I once read a book, I had it once, I don't know whatever happened to it. I think it was called From Tadpoles to God, I think was the book. And it can have, the intellect can contain anything, any knowledge whatsoever. But, not equally of course. Anything above us, we know analogically. We know what it's like, what it's more than, or what it should be more than, and etc. We know it that way. We know it in a qualified way, analogically. It's not this, it's more than that. Observation of the sense organs and their employment reveals a distinction between the impassibility of the sensitive and that of the intellective faculty. After strong stimulation of a sense, we are less able to exercise it than before. As, for example, that E.G. I found very odd, but that was a classical writer wrote that, instead of just putting for example. Where was we? In the case of a loud sound, we cannot hear easily immediately after. Or in the case of a bright colour or a powerful odour, we cannot see or smell. But in the case of mind, thought about an object that is highly intelligible renders it more and not less able afterwards to think objects that are less intelligible. The reason is that while the faculty of sensation is dependent upon the body, mind is separable from it. When we see a great flash of lightning or something like that, or a great flash of, let's say lightning's not a good example, of course, for many reasons, but we get a bright light. After that you can't see well. I was going through the Suez Canal. We're being buzzed by NASA's planes, by the way, his fighters, when I was on the SS Strathmore. I think it was his last voyage, incidentally. And looking out over the desert, the Sinai Peninsula, you're looking like that, you're peering. But then you look around at something else, you find it, you've got to blink your eyes for a while. Why? Because rhodopsin and materials or chemicals in the sight, the organ, have to be restored in order to see again. And according to the ophthalmologist, there are about 200 actions take place when you just look at something, all through the body. And I remember standing behind, I think it was 8 16-pound cannon firing. And the fellow next to me said something to me, and all I could see was just his lips moving. Couldn't hear a thing, because the ear was affected by the intense pounding of the cannon, and it was very difficult to hear each other till the ear restored itself with the chemical substances, because the power of hearing depends upon the movements and all the chemical substances which form those little hair cells, etc., in the middle ear, which prepares for hearing. So, in the case of mind, thought about an object that is highly intelligible renders it more and not less able to think. If somebody grasps a very fine distinction, you say, hello, good intellect here. The intellect uses the brain to operate on, not in. As we show further on here, the intellect operates on an object, on material things, it operates on that, and on the imagery in the brain, but it exists without matter and operates its do without matter, subjectively. When its objective or its operation is independent of matter, except for its object. So the three things you've got to be careful of. One, it can exist without matter. Two, it acts without matter. Three, but it acts on matter. So, observation of the sense organs and their employment reveals a distinction, etc. Mind is separable from matter. That was the only way Aristotle could express himself, because the Arabs took that up and completely misunderstood it. I've seen that in languages, in other languages, people misunderstanding a term. Boy, it makes a big difference. Once the mind has become each set of its possible objects, as a man of science has, when this phrase is used of one who is actually a man of science, this happens when he is now able to exercise the power on his own initiative. Its condition is still one of potentiality, but in a different sense from the potentiality which preceded the acquisition of knowledge by learning or discovery. The mind too is then able to think itself. Supposing Einstein and a child is sitting under the tree. The child has a capacity for physics, and so is Einstein. But there are two different kinds of capacities. Einstein's got the formation of the science, and he can go and do acts in physics, but the child, he has to learn physics. So his potency for doing acts of physics or mathematics is different from the mathematician and Einstein. Einstein was not a mathematician, by the way. It's commonly thought he is, but he wasn't. He was a physicist. But the child has a capacity, or this child, when it grows up, is going to be a great mathematician. But the other man, who's a mathematician sitting under the same tree, he has a different capacity. He now has the habit of the science, and he can go and employ it and express himself mathematically. That's what he's getting at here. And he's saying that the mind is able to think itself, think about itself, if you like, or think using its object itself, the object of its thought. Now, Avicenna, his misinterpretation of Aristotle, the agent intellect is separate. Averroes went one further. Misinterpretation of Aristotle and Avicenna, agent and possible intellects are separate from us. St. Thomas, I better put from us, correct that. St. Thomas, following Aristotle's text, newly translated directly from Greek into Latin, William Moabig, translator, he was a Dominican. Agent intellect and possible intellect are spiritual operative powers of the human soul. That came out to the fore very much. Prior to that, the Arabs had distorted the meaning of Aristotle's text. There are a great number of proofs that the human intellect, on page 64, that the human intellect is utterly immaterial, utter immateriality, we call that spirituality. These are set out in a somewhat simplified form. Now, the first argument, from the immateriality of the object. Principle of reason. Whatever is received according to the manner of the recipient. This is what that means. If I want to carry 2 gallons of water, I get a 2-gallon bucket, not a 1 gallon. Whatever's received is conditioned by the receiver. And if I want to talk to mathematics, I talk to a mathematician, not a little child. Whatever is received in the manner of the recipient. Quid recipitur, recipitur in modo recipientis in Latin. That's the famous principle. The condition of the recipient. Fact, the human intellect, the soul, the soul is a power of the intellect, intellect's a power of the soul rather, receives an object which is universal. It is universal because it is immaterial. Cause of the fact, the human intellect is immaterial. That is, it has no matter in its nature. Woodbury has these proofs all elaborated. For a number of reasons, I didn't copy all his elaboration. B, another way for the same argument. Do follows B. Fact. Intellective knowledge is an immaterial knowledge because it has a universal object. That is, it is an immaterial do. For instance, this is its do, it knows man, a universal. We know it knows thousands of things. Insult, imagery, love, these are all immaterial things. The cause of the fact, in other words, the conclusion. The intellective knowledge is an immaterial B. Do follows B. If the do is immaterial of the intellective knowledge is an immaterial B. That is, the human intellect is immaterial, has immaterial B. Any questions or any requests for further explanation of that? Second argument, from reflection of the intellect over its own act. Active reflection. I know that 2 plus 2 equal 4. The object of the act know is this. 2 plus 2 equal 4. I know that 2 plus 2 equal 4. I thought I'd cut that out, that extra plus there. Equal 4. The object of this act know is the other act of knowing. I know what? I know that I know. That's a reflect act. There's where the intellect can bend back over itself. That is, I'm conscious of this, that I know that 2 plus 2 equal 4. So the first act of knowing, I know that 2 and 2 equal 4, but the second act of knowing is the first act of knowing. Its object is the first act of knowing. There can be no intercompenetration of matter. Matter cannot penetrate matter. Therefore, since the intellect can penetrate itself by reflection, there must be no matter in its nature. Put in another way, the intellect is a self-reflective power. Sight is not a self-reflective power because it has an organ. The power of sight works through the organ of sight to see the red cloth. So it has to put the organ between itself and its object, so it cannot see itself. The organ must be used by the power. The organ must come between the power and its object. But matter cannot penetrate itself. That is, it cannot bend over backwards to see itself. But the intellect can bend over backwards to understand itself. And even a little child does it, even though can't explain it, could not explain it. Therefore, the intellect lacks matter on page 65. For its be and its do, subjectively, but requires matter for its do objectively. Its object is presented by the internal senses. That is, the intellect requires a material object which it can see, touch, hear, etc., through the external and then the internal senses. The brain is the organ of the internal senses. That's very clear. I put this, added this today. Although something's playing up with the print there, the size of the print. I don't know what's going wrong there. So, in the words of St. Thomas, proof from express reflection as this excludes mediation of an organ owing to an organ's extension. The intellect understands itself, which does not happen by some power which is such that its operation is through a corporal organ, a bodily organ. Whereas the reason is, as Avicenna says, of whatsoever power which operates through a corporeal organ, it must needs be that the organ be a medium between the power itself and its object. For sight knows nothing except that whereof the species can be effected in the pupil. Therefore, since it is not possible that a corporal organ, a bodily organ, there's a switch over there, would somebody please, that a corporal organ fall as a medium between some power and the essence itself of the power, it will not be possible that some power operating by the medium of a corporal organ know itself. It cannot know itself if it had a power there. An organ there. And this proof is touched in the book of Causes, on causes, in that 15th proposition, etc. The book of Causes, nobody is utterly certain. A friend of mine published a work on it and thought he showed that it was Proclus, copied by Proclus. But it's a medieval thing which nobody knows exactly who the author is.
Excuse me. This may sound stupid, but
no, nothing stupid.
What you're saying is that the intellect is self-conscious.
Yes.
Not self-consciousness. Okay.
That's right.
Now, what is the relationship between the intellect and the brain? For instance, when the brain...
Well, as I said before, that's the brain is the seat of the internal senses,
internal senses.
and they feed the intellect. The intellect operates on them.
So what happens when the brain is disabled through stroke or...
Well, we can't think because we haven't got although there's evidence that a person can think but cannot express themselves. One of the worst things that goes to a person who's had a stroke is their speech. And they thought might go on there, but it's very difficult for them to speak and express it. But if the brain is paralyzed or some grave damage is done, the intellect cannot be fed its images.
So it's still there?
Oh yeah. Well, the intellect's still there.
And then if the person dies, then the intellect is free?
The intellect is a power of the soul, so the soul is free, yes. You see, it's an operative power of the soul. We deal with that, I think, in the next section. So, from which it appears that the intellective principle has absolute be, not depending on the body. That's in...
You're just saying that it has absolute be, not dependent upon the body. But now we're just saying that if the brain is damaged, it is dependent upon the brain.
Well, it's dependent for its object. It has absolute be, not depending on the body. It exists. Its existence doesn't depend upon the body. The intellect. That part of the soul was the intellective power. But you see, it's dependent upon the body for its operation. Only depend on being fed. But look, when we're asleep, we think. We're sound asleep. And what happens is, as Settilange points out, you sometimes deal with a problem when you go to sleep. But when you wake up, you've got the solution to the problem. That often happens. I've gone to bed and I can't write a thing. I just so tired, etc. Then I wake up next morning, I can read it, I can dictate. Different viewpoint altogether. On the other hand, if you write something going to bed, sometimes next morning you get up and say, who wrote this rubbish? I did. That can happen. Now in the Summa, in the book of sentences, this really translated, in my opinion, means the book of opinions. Sententia means opinion in Latin. And there was a famous philosopher in the Middle Ages that men used to write their doctoral theses by commenting on this. And St. Thomas's is in, which means on, the second book of sentences. And distinction 19, article 1. Niagara University, I was told by a certain gentleman, got rid of 7 truckloads of books. And I have book 1 only of this. Might have given anything to God. They gave 3 volumes of the book of sentences to some bookseller in Buffalo. Boy, I was furious. It weren't offered to the faculty at all. Nobody is capable of reflective activity, for it was shown in 7 and 8, physics. That's Aristotle's book of physics. That a body moves itself only according to a part. Part moves part. Remember that? We talked about that before, the early part. One part being the mover and the other has the moved. But intellect does have reflective activity, since it knows itself, not merely according to a part, but according to the whole. Therefore, it is not a body. It's not part, move, part. That's in the Summa contra Gentiles. That's written by St. Thomas, at the request of the Dominicans, 4 books, to argue against the Gentiles. The Gentiles meant the foreigners. Doesn't mean the non-Jews, but in the Jewish understanding, we are the foreigners, the Christians, you see. Well, the Gentiles, Summa contra Gentiles, with the Arabs, the Muslims, etc., and the Dominican fathers were struggling with them, and they asked St. Thomas, could you run something off to help us? Because St. Thomas, it is said, dictated to 4, one authority says, another says 6 secretaries at once. Of course, he could dictate an answer, and while he's writing down this answer, he could dictate to another secretary, manifesting an enormous genius that St. Thomas had. So, that reflects activity of the intellect. Now we go into a little excursion, as it is called, on consciousness, which falls in nicely with this argument. Just as there is a power of sensitive consciousness, remember the 5 external senses are united in the sensitive consciousness, so there is intellective consciousness. But sensitive consciousness requires a separate power because of the materiality of the organ. Does intellective consciousness require a separate power also? Not necessary, because of the lack of an organ. Note the following. I know that 2 plus equal 4. This is direct knowledge. Now I know that 2 plus 2 equal 4. This is what we mean when we say, I realize that 2 plus 2 equal 4. This is a reflex act and denotes consciousness of the first act of knowledge. Thus, if this required another power, as in the sensitive order, then if we can reflect ad infinitum, we go on reflecting. Where are we? Then there would be required an infinite series of powers whereby these infinite series of reflections would be exercised. Therefore, the same power does the act of reflection, whereby is exercised acts of consciousness. Consciousness comes from 2 words. Con, which is the same as cum in Latin, and scio, when we get the word science. Scio means in Latin, I know. Now that's the classic. See, there are 2 pronunciations in Latin, scio and scio. And I lean, not as someone say, oh, that's church Latin. No, that's the most classical Latin. That's the Latin the Romans most likely as different ones. Hogben, for instance, said that it's most likely they spoke that pronunciation. But in schools, they teach them the Germanic pronunciation. I don't know why. I know, thou knowest, and he knows. So, so they prefer them to learn this. Scio, skis, skit. If you use the Latin or the Roman pronunciation, shio, shis, shit. So I can see why. You can see that coming. So, in Scio et credo, I know and I believe, was our motto at this high school I went to in Australia. But the teachers never used the the Roman pronunciation, because I think they avoided certain words that sounded very nasty. So, see, the actual infinite cannot exist. Infinite means unfinished. How can it be unfinished? Exist means it's finished. It can't be unfinished and finished at the same time. It's absurd. So you can't have an infinite series of intellects all reflecting, knowing the other one, unless there's reflect activity. The intellect knows itself. But you can't have an intellect that causes it to know itself and another intellect that causes that, and so on. That'd be absurd. You'll have to reflect on that a bit. Through knowledge of another, for example a tree, I can have knowledge of my act of knowledge. That is, the intellect in act. That then allows me to have knowledge of my intellect, for the intellect must be in act, since I cannot have knowledge of the intellect alone, since it is a potency. Knowledge requires a form, not mere potency. In other words, the intellect has to be in act, actually thinking, for it to know itself. I have to know something. Know my sight, a tree or something, to put the intellect in act in order for it to be able to reflect on itself. Because it's a pure potency. It can't just think about itself. It's it doesn't make sense. That it's got to be informed before it can, it's got to be given some nature before it can reflect on itself. So, now the third argument, from knowledge of all bodies. And this is the big argument, which the philosophers prefer. The principle, that which can be many, according to itself, does be none. Now, for instance, the water. Water can be hot, can be cold, or can be hot. If according to itself it was hot, it could never be cold. If hotness was in its nature, it couldn't be cold. If cold were in its nature, it could not be hot. Sight. We know, and we know from experience, water can be hot or cold. Sight can become blue or red. If blue was in its nature, it couldn't see red. If red was in its nature, it couldn't see blue. Now, the human intellect is a pure power. It has to become actualized by some form, informed. It has to be formed into some nature. It can be a tree, it can be a rock, it can be an animal, it can be man. It can be billions of things if we live long enough. Therefore, none of them are in its nature. It can be all bodies, therefore there's no body in its nature. A rock is a material thing, and that image of the rock can come to our internal senses and inform us in the manner that a rock is informed. So the intellect has none of these bodily things in its nature, because it can be all bodies. Therefore, no body is in its nature. That's the sense of the argument there. I've set that out fairly carefully. That which can be many, according to itself, does be none. That's what Anaxagoras said. In order to have all bodies, all natures, it must have none of them in its own nature. to dominate, in order to know, it must have none of those things in its nature. Now here's the third argument. This is set up beautifully in Woodbury's work, unpublished work. Principle of reason. That which appears inwardly hinders and obstructs the extraneous. That is, that which can be many, according to itself, does be none. Water can be many. I think I'll add something there. That which can be many, or water can be many, hot or cold, therefore according to itself it is neither. Sight, intellect, as I showed on the board. Fact. The human intellect can be all bodies. Cause of the fact. In other words, the conclusion. The human intellect has no body in its nature. I've set it up in a rather simplistic form there. Woodbury talking to Dominican fathers from the Philippine Islands. I drove him out there to see in Sydney, they were visiting there, the Wurunga Dominican fathers. These men were associated with the huge University of Santo Tomas in Manila. There used to be 11 universities in Manila. I knew the people from the embassy there. And he pointed out to them that this, what he set up, the proof here, was uniquely set up. It is beautifully put up. He used to say it teach the theory of knowledge to a fence. So, the conclusion, this is taken from St. Thomas. It must necessarily be granted that the principle of intellectual operation, which we call the soul of man, is a principle both incorporeal and subsistent. It's without matter, but yet it exists as a substance. In other words, it has its own mode of existence. What is, as I think Anton Pages researched this all his life, and he found this extremely difficult to understand. It's easy to see that the human intellect is spiritual. It's difficult to see how the human soul is the form of a body, the form of matter. It's easy to see that it's immaterial, but how it can be mixed with matter, that's very difficult. I learned that from Dr. Gallagher from the De Rancy Foundation, who was the president of the De Rancy Foundation. He said that Anton found it very difficult. And it's all contained in his little book, the preface of his little book, I've forgotten what it is now, The Basic Writings of St. Thomas or something. So it's incorporeal, without matter, and subsistent. It exists. You're subsistent, I'm subsistent. We exist, we stand up as matter. We're a substance. Rather than matter, substance, subsistent. Fact, for it is clear that by means of the intellect man can know all corporeal things. Principle, all bodily things, principle. Now, whatever knows certain things cannot have any of them in its own nature, because that which is in it naturally would impede the knowledge of anything else. Thus we observe that a sick man's tongue, being unbalanced by a feverish and bitter humour, those liquids we talked about before, humour really means some kind of a liquid, is insensible to anything sweet, and everything seems bitter to it. Therefore, if the intellectual principle contained within itself the nature of any body, it would be unable to know all bodies. Now, every body has its own determinate nature. Therefore, it is impossible for the intellectual principle to be a body. It could have no other bodies in its nature. If it knows all bodies, none of them must be in its nature. It is also impossible for it to understand by means of a bodily organ, since the determinate nature of that organ would likewise impede knowledge of all bodies, as when a certain determinate colour is not only in the pupil of the eye, but also in a glass vase. The liquid in the vase seems to be of that same colour. Therefore, the intellectual principle, which we call the mind or the intellect, has essentially an operation in which the body does not share. Now, only that which subsists in itself can have an operation in itself, for nothing can operate but what is actual. and so a thing operates according as it is. For which reason we do not say that heat imparts heat, but that what is hot gives heat. We must conclude therefore that the human soul, which is called intellect or mind, is something non-bodily and subsistent. We'll just finish up with this last bit. Reply to objection 3. The body is necessary for the action of the intellect, not as its organ of action, but on the part of the object. For the image is to the intellect what colour is to the sight. Neither does such a dependence on the body prove the intellect to be non-subsistent. For otherwise it would follow that an animal is non-subsistent simply because it requires external sensibles for sensation. A friend of mine was a very powerful mind. In fact, Father Geiger, who was one of the great metaphysicians of this 20th century, he said, Monsieur Doyle est très intelligent, n'est-ce pas? He's a very powerful mind, he said. I said, yes, he is. But what I didn't tell him is things like that Monsieur Doyle did not understand. John Doyle was a classmate of mine. He studied at Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto, got a master's degree, but had not obtained a doctorate. He never got it, as a matter of fact. But he couldn't understand some of these things. That light is to the pupil what the object is to the intellect. He couldn't understand that. It's a very strange thing. That the principles of reason are to the intellect like lamps are to the sight. The principles of reason light up and let us see into the intelligibility of reality. He could not follow that. I would like you to reflect over some of these proofs, particularly that last one, and we'll talk about that again next class. And I'm sorry about that last page being blank. I was going to put something else in there, partly blank anyway. You possibly, if you're keen enough to aware this, that are we off the air now? Can we? Put us off the air. But what I'm going through is the radiation. It's the young ladies and the young black gentlemen. They're lovely in there. I said to Brian Sullivan, who's the physician's assistant that sort of is supervising there, it's quite a big place, and they've got at least, I don't know how many they've got, but there are 2 of these big machines that rotate around you. And they warned me that I must not drive. One man did drive himself home and fell asleep at the wheel and found himself on somebody's lawn. It doesn't cause any pain or anything like that, but Dr. Kettle, Kuettel, he spells it. He said, you're only part way through, remember? I'm in the 2nd week, and I've got 7 weeks of this, and it is affecting me. You know, I'm tired beyond all reason, and they said that would happen. I get picked up the morning at 10 to 8, and the American Cancer Society have a different driver each morning, and one of them was so generous last week. My garage door is having trouble. He said, let me have a look at that. Next thing, the garage door now is functioning perfectly. I was so grateful to Mike. He just lubricated. I said, I had the lubricant there, and somebody who should have been in this class tonight was the one who was going to do it for me. It never ever did it. Anyway, it's producing a lot of effects on the body. Makes you tired, particularly, and upsets your stomach, etc. So if I did, you'll understand if there's little things I have to correct occasionally. I thought I edited this thoroughly, but I see things there I want to change now. A few little things. So, Mr. Venari, you might want to get the changed version if you're printing it up. I'll tell you when it comes. A few little changes I want to make. That last page, I might put another text in there too. This is beautiful, this stuff. In fact, I thought of getting Woodbury, but it's too big a job, getting all of his stuff on here. But it's unpublished, and, well, the question, they don't prove it. They are juvenile. And as for the great common sense philosopher, John Locke, The English empiricist now, Woodbury was English to his fingertips. He knew the kings and queens of England, and he was very English. His family had lived on the Hawkesbury River for 130 years, and that was, I'm talking about 50 years ago, he told us that. And 40 years ago or something, I don't know. Anyway, he said, English never could do any bloody philosophy. He said, never were for good philosophers. Right back to the Bishop Thomas and Kilwardby, who helped condemn St. Thomas's work. But they don't prove things. They're just sort of the common sense philosopher. Well, I'm sorry, but philosophy goes a lot beyond common sense. It's common sense precisified, if you like, made more precise. But the English-speaking world, as Father Martinelli said, it's all based upon the what do you call it? The metaphysics of, which means no metaphysics, of David Hume. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume existed as one person who lived a long time, you might say, and Hume is the last one. And his stuff is skepticism from beginning to end. We should be recording that, I suppose, but anyway, that's okay. So we'll finish up there tonight. Thank you.